Hello, everyone, and welcome to the week ahead. This week, we are beginning with the moon in Pisces. And I've been really reflecting on this collective theme of beliefs um, and disillusionment. Disillusionment as it relates to all kinds of things. I've talked about this a bit in the Neptune Saturn video that I did, independent of the week ahead. It's a special report. But in the light of the election in the United States, which happened last week on Tuesday, and I talked about how the moon was in Capricorn at that time, squaring the nodes, and there's a crisis in consciousness that occurs. And I certainly could have predicted the outcome of the election, but I feel like, it's in the hands of God and man, and I didn't want to put in my perspective in that way. But in the wake, I've witnessed quite a lot of people, maybe even millions of people facing disillusionment. And then the side effect of disillusionment of any kind, whether it's of an experience in our life where we held a belief in something or we lost something, right? Disillusionment carries the energy of loss. Right behind that is always grief. Grief is there waiting to acknowledge the presence of loss. And of course, as this for many people was a celebratory event and a validation of their beliefs, for many, this was an experience of a transformation of their beliefs. I heard feedback from many people who would previously have voted a different way and made the choice in this election season to vote. Um, and that change happened within them. Obviously, the point that I want to make, I'm not here to make right, wrong. I think that this experience that we're having is a perfect example of evolutionary necessity. Evolutionary necessity underlies that there are things that happen in our life which are not what we would have wanted. However, without the occurrence of such, um, the soul itself would not be catalyzed into an evolutionary process. And a part of what we're working with Saturn, Neptune, is the disillusionment, the grief, the humanity of our collective unification, our collective unity, where we all are actually one from the one source, from God. We all go back, we all come from wherever. We all go back to wherever. We could call it eternity, timelessness, universal. Um, our and you don't have to believe in reincarnation or past lives or any of that to be relevant to the truth that, like, we come here and we go and we don't know, right? And we don't know, and we form faith and belief in something. We make meaning out of things in our life, and anything that we give ultimate meaning to, when it's rooted in the human level, when it's rooted in the um, relationship of man to man, of human being to human being, has the potentiality for disillusionment and grief, because we are putting meaning in something or someone or an event or a dream or a vision. And if we give that ultimate meaning, ultimately the expectations, the desires, the reality can often come into conflict and create a sense of loss, create a sense of meaninglessness and create a sense of disillusionment. And so, as I've witnessed many people facing that, in part mostly because they were surprised, right? It's very easy to become identified with what we believe will happen or should happen or could happen, and not keep open-mindedness to the reality that others may feel differently, act differently, and that when that comes as a surprise, of course, there's a wave of grief. Similar to the expectation that, like, oh, this person's going to be in my life. And then if all of a sudden the relationship is severed, or all of a sudden they pass away, right? Even the loss of a pet, or the loss, let's say in parts of the East Coast, North Carolina, Florida, where there was devastation from the waters. One moment we're living in a reality where we don't have to consider um, catastrophe, disaster, and we're just going through the motions of our life and making meaning of things, and the next moment everything is washed away. Naturally, there's going to be grief. Naturally, there's going to be a sense of meaninglessness or disappointment or disillusionment that follows with that. That is the reality check ultimately to our emotional body. And I see, of course, in crises like that, many people respond with immense compassion and empathy. And that compassion and empathy goes right into being of service in a way that is humble and human, and irregardless of political, ideological, religious, individual belief systems. There becomes no separation, and people become helpful, truly helpful. To what? To the higher purpose and meaning of all human beings being here on the planet, which is for us to love one another, to learn to love unconditionally, is one of the most challenging assignments we can receive, but I think it's the fundamental assignment that we receive from birth. And of course, evolutionary necessity, as I was saying earlier, often forces us into those situations where we would not otherwise face the discomfort of our reality not matching our beliefs, or face the discomfort of other people's belief systems or ideas, or the suffering, let's say, that's caused in the world. These things then can kind of have us walking through life, um, you know, not challenged to grow. And so, of course, I think no matter what side of the road you might find yourself on, what belief system or what, um, you know, idea you have about what's happening in the world, we're all on the same road. There isn't two roads. There is just one that we're all walking on. And ultimately, a part of the crisis of consciousness relative to beliefs is that how do we live in relationship, especially when many of those beliefs are self-destructive. Not only destructive, to the human being, but they are destructive to the world. They bring about war, violence, things that we can fundamentally say, like, that hurts people. That is, not the way that I want to live, but yet continues um in happening all the time, regardless of who's in office, politically speaking, right? The United States and the presidential um person is a microcosm of a whole universal and global phenomenon, where human beings haven't learned how to live in right relationship to one another, and that becomes or in right relationship to the earth. And so then we see this happening all over the world in various different forms of crises. But until that evolutionary necessity reaches our doorstep, until that grief or that, like I had an experience this week where I received some news and it really brought up in me this deep sadness and this despair. I could do nothing but feel my disappointment, like the depression that it brought up in me. I could do nothing but actually recognize, like, oh, this is a very familiar feeling of disappointment. It's dressed up in a different person, in a different situation, than maybe even something that's also very familiar. However, here it is right at my doorstep, offering me the opportunity to relate to it differently. And while I don't, I know my tendency to want to, um, I laid in bed for a little while and just like let myself cry. I allowed myself to feel the sadness, to feel the grief, to feel the disappointment, to identify where it was familiar, where it was old, you know, to look at what I could, how I could accept and have understanding for the other person, for their position, for their belief systems, for the choice that they were making, and how at the same time I had to be willing to also feel how that felt so different from my desires and my expectations, right? Because bottom line, what the intention of my heart was unification, bringing us all together. And some people aren't able to meet us in that call for various reasons. I don't necessarily think that it makes them wrong or bad, but I could identify with it myself where I felt as though I had done something wrong. Or if I am doing something wrong, that I wanted to be able to find that. And I think that has to do with, what we're dealing with regard to Saturn. And this week, so this week we have Venus, and this all happened the other day when Venus was squaring Neptune, right? Belief systems, ideas, and Venus, which also has to do with the feminine, but she's in the sign of Sagittarius. And Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. Now, Sagittarius pertains to natural law. There's a need for freedom to be our natural selves, and ruled by Jupiter, there is an apparent conflict or duality. I could see how the division, the separation that we can occur within our minds can be these conflicting thoughts or ideas about what's the right way to live, who's the right person, what's the right thing. And whether it's in a relationship and you're questioning whether a partner is the right partner for you, whether it's in a job and you have work that you're doing maybe that has lost its meaning, but you don't yet have a sense of where you're called to go or what you're called to do, whether it's in a country where the division has led to choices being made that are outside of your control, there there's an ultimate lesson here in what and how we make meaning of things in our life. And with this Venus square Neptune that we had on Saturday, then Venus is approaching the end of Sagittarius. She'll enter the sign of Capricorn this week. So right now she's ruled by Jupiter, then she'll be ruled by Saturn. And then we have Mercury, who's in Sagittarius in its retrograde shadow degrees, who will make a square to Saturn this this week as well, right after Venus enters the sign of Capricorn. And, a part of what we struggle with Mercury, how do we authentically express and actually speak to the deeper truth that is inside of us in the face of deeply conditioned beliefs, ideas, um, you know, ways, rules, laws, ways of being, which are like, oh yeah, that's so, that's so, that's the way it is. This is what it is, where if we cannot question our reality, even for ourselves, right? Looking at, and I was thinking a lot this week about what is the original narrative, right? From a biblical perspective, we could call that the book of Genesis, right? We could call that the original story. And in a lot of cultures, many different cultures have an original story. But each of us as human beings has within ourselves, I think, an original narrative, one which we've been walking around since childhood with. Oh, you're that way. Or, oh, you've always been like this person. Or, oh, you've always felt this way in your family. Let's say there's a feeling of not belonging, being different from everyone else in the family. Oh, I've always been an outsider. And that original narrative often is formed at a young age, I would say between the ages of 3 to 5, when the egoic consciousness, when the identity is being formed and shaped not so much consciously but by the reflections of those around us, those who are seeing us. So in a way, compacted into that original narrative about the self, who we are authentically, gets built in this belief system, an idea that actually is formed at a very tender and sacred time, but has little to nothing to do with the actuality of our being. Unless we're fortunate to have parents who see us and, celebrate our uniqueness and support our individuation in a big way, most of us are conditioned by social patterns, belief systems, religious or social conditioning, family conditioning, family imprinting, and that sort of forms this outer layer of story around the who I am that can walk with us all through our lives, operating on an unconscious level, limiting what it is that we believe we're capable of. Oh, my mom told me I could never sing on key. So my whole life has been this struggle of feeling one, inadequate to be able to sing on key. And she blamed it on a kindergarten teacher who sang off key and my desire to model the kindergarten teacher, which I don't necessarily know has any basis in reality. It was a story that was told to me. And thus, I internalize this sense of inferiority around singing, this inability to hear or be attuned to um, harmony, right? And of course, then in my relationship, I'm partnered with a person who has a deep desire to sing in harmony with others. And then this sense of constantly not being enough because I have this internalized original story of not being able to sing on key. And dismantling that has, in many ways brought me face to face with the a fundamental story of not good enough, right? But also a deep desire to sing. And, one of the messages I received, you know, in one of my ceremonies was that I have been a singer since the beginning, right? And a couple of times here and there I've received songs and I have felt myself and heard myself sing quite beautifully and on key. So, we have to, in many ways, begin to identify what that original story is. Because the things that are playing out in our life, both individually and collectively, are a root, they are a foundation, they are an initiation and a conditioning of that origin story. And in order for us to resolve the past, in order for us to break through the crisis of consciousness, in order for us to really say, oh, I am who I am and I claim who I claim creative authority over my life, I claim my desires, I claim my vision for myself and for others. And of course, I claim the calling that I have to become the unconditional love in the world, the expression of love in the world that is my own unique expression. We have to be able to break down and be disillusioned by our own original story, by our own imprinting, by the collective imprinting, the collective story that continues to um, characterize many of the choices that are being made for us, around us, and all the ways in which we as human beings fail to unconditionally love one another, but to, continue to perpetuate suffering in the world. And, not, and we all have our role in this unwinding of this story. It's going to be unique to each and every one of us, but I think this becomes part of the gift that we give as we heal that, as we come to recognize, and the other thing that's happening this week is that Venus is moving into her square to the nodal axis. This will be her final square in this Aries Libra nodal transit, and one in which she is perfecting her skip step in evolutionary astrology. When a planet squares the nodes, it creates a skip step in which a soul is said to be flip-flopping, or in this case, collectively flip-flopping back and forth between the south node, the past, our sort of dynamics, fruitive dynamics from the past, and the north node, what the core calling of the soul. And the resolution node in this case with Venus is the south node, which she rules in Libra. It's how do we resolve relationship with our authentic truth, our authentic identity, seeking to emerge itself out of this conditioned narrative. And a lot of that narrative, if it relates in our life to lessons, to loss, to grief, to disillusionment, these are the very things that we are needing to face and feel in order to rewire our orientation towards life so that we can move forward. Her perfected square will happen sometime Friday night into Saturday, late Friday, as well as Saturn stationing direct. And we've been working with this Saturn in Pisces. This is the second retrograde cycle of Saturn in Pisces. This will move Saturn forward towards its ultimate Saturn-Neptune conjunction next year, which will happen in Aries. And so much of what I think we're dealing with right now, especially, will come to its real apparent fullness in the time that the nodes of the moon move back into Pisces, Virgo as well. And this week we have a full moon. So we end the week on Friday with this full moon in Taurus, with the sun in Scorpio opposite the moon in Taurus, conjunct Uranus, right? There's a quality of liberation. Interestingly enough, on election day, the moon was here squaring the nodes where Venus is now squaring the nodes, and she's the ruler of the moon. So we can we can see kind of the continuation, the fruition of that lunar square to the nodes, which gave us a precursor, and a part of what I've heard from a lot of different commentaries is that the underlying economic conditions were not really addressed. And I think that's quite true. In our collective reality, we have had rising prices of especially food, Taurus, survival necessities, Taurus, Scorpio, food, gas, housing, the basic needs of human beings to survive. You know, you have to shelter your family, your children. You have to feed them. You have to be able to, you know, do your livelihood, your work, right? These systems have not been supporting the average person for a long time. There is an epidemic of single parents who struggle to feed their children. There is an epidemic of homelessness, of people who are living on the streets or living in housing insecure situations. There is an epidemic of joblessness or job insecurity or job um, I would call it job disillusionment, where people are in jobs where they feel stuck or trapped, but are unable to make changes because they lack the financial resources or freedom to be able to make those kind of decisions for themselves. And yet, what does all that do? It suppresses the individual needs and desires. It suppresses the creative actualization of people, where I think many people, if they had the means and the ability and the freedom, they would absolutely desire to be of greater service in the world. But where they're having to prioritize whether or not they can feed their family and pay their rent over whether or not they can serve and give in various different ways, there's a survival necessity and a mechanism that goes in front of our natural desire to be in service in the world, in relationship to others even, and a part of living in such a isolated um individualism, which has has further been accentuated since COVID, um, means that people feel more and more alone, more and more responsible for heavy burdens, and without the proper support, whether it's government support or family support or, cultural support or religious support or economic support, and without the proper support to really be and create a thriving and nourishing life. And I think as we see Venus and Ceres, the mother goddess, and Pluto coming to a conjunction, which will happen in December, we're moving towards the seed of a new connection to our humanity, which allows more of that mutual support to be created through community, through people being in a sense of unity in their unique individualism, but in meeting one another in our needs and in our resource and sharing our resources and how we work together and how we collaborate and how we think, and that ultimately will bring about, of course, a dismantling of the shadow of the things that have undermined people living in community for much of the last, 100 years, right? Those things will have to come to the surface. So again, here we face that same evolutionary necessity of, wow, well, we wouldn't sort of like push ourselves out of our bubble if there weren't a cataclysmic event in our lives that rocked our world. And whether it's the loss of a relationship, the death of a spouse or partner, the death of a family member, the loss of a child, right? The things that are like horrific grief, catastrophe, natural disaster, war, the loss of economic security, either through divorce, through loss of a job, the loss of our personal health and well-being, all these different losses and disillusionments ultimately lead us to that path of healing. So I'm trying to, at the end of the week here, shed a little light on where we might feel a sense of grief or disillusionment, where we might feel a sense of confusion or um, alienation, where we might feel a sense of, uh, you know, challenge, a crisis essentially in how we are to proceed with our lives in this way, regardless. Like maybe you're very, very excited about the change, and that will still mean things in our lives. We will still see, we will still see all sorts of um, evolution occurring. We can always be guaranteed that evolution is happening, that whatever is will be continuing to transform, and that, I believe, bottom line, that this is a healing journey that we're all on, and that the pathway, the one path, regardless of what side you're walking on that path, the one path is the path that returns us to love. And so if we know, okay, I'm on this one path, there are these other people, right? Whenever we other people, we become other people. And so we have a choice here. This sort of crisis begets a choice of how we choose to look at. And I think the root of it being how we go back to our initial original narrative, that one that is formed in relationship to ourselves, to our personal identity, but also to our beliefs, that underlies our beliefs and operates consciously or unconsciously to inform our way of seeing the world. Because it's that very nature that will question and help us to really be able to see a bigger vision of what's happening right now, and step out of grief and step out of disillusionment and step out of loss and into a place of personal and collective hope, into a place of optimism and a real sense of creative purpose in, oh yeah, okay, I was born at this time and I am facing these things in my life, and this is exactly what I am here for. So I hope, my friends, that you have a beautiful week ahead. We end the week with this Mercury opposite Jupiter, as after Mercury's square, after the square to the nodes, after the full moon in Taurus. I think there will be a lot of building of energy in the week where we start to really see how this affects the bottom line physical, financial, emotional security through this core belief system and narrative. And that I hope and I pray for you that it brings peace, resolution, and uh, a new wind of faith and optimism. And faith, being in that the presence of love is moving all of us on the same road, irregardless of the illusion of separation, irregardless of the disillusionment of loss, and irregardless of what story we might have about what's happening in our life, that this is a core opportunity in which we get to begin again and return to our ourselves and make that connection, right, from before we received that original conditioning, that original story. There was a seed of our soul that arrived here that knew exactly who it is, what it's here for, and what the world is all about. So I would say, to close, who are you becoming, who you have already become, who you were born to be, who you have always known yourself to be, And as the layers of grief or disillusionment, as the ideas or the beliefs or the old stories fall away, will you allow yourself the grace of learning who you truly are? All right, my friends. Um, I hope you have a beautiful week ahead. If you're interested in learning more about planets that square the nodes, Ari Moshe just started a Planet Squaring the Nodes class series. It's a 12-week class series. Last week we did Pluto squaring the nodes. This week it will be Mars squaring the nodes. I believe you can still join that. I'll have a link to that class in the description of this video. I am in my last several weeks of doing readings. So if you want to book a session with me before the end of the year, now's the time to do it. There's a link on in the description to purchase a reading with me. I'll be doing one-on-one readings scheduled through the end of November or until this baby comes. And then I will be unavailable until after the first of the year. So, and now's a great time to really tune in to what that particular core soul story is, what the dynamics are that are arising in your life. And if I can give love and reflection and guidance to that, it'd be a great honor. So, all right, my friends, so much love. As always, leave me your thoughts, your heart. Your emojis in the comments and give this video a like, a thumbs up. Let me know how you're doing. I love to hear from you so much. Bye for now.